So if someone were to look exclusively at your bank statement and your calendar from the last 12 months, what would they conclude is the absolute most important thing in your life?
Oh, wow. That's quite a way to start.
Right. And I'm not asking, what you say is important to you. I'm not
Yeah.
asking what you post about on social media or those deep philosophical ideals you talk about over dinner with your friends.
Certainly aspirational stuff.
Exactly. I am asking a relentlessly objective, incredibly invasive question based purely on the data,
Just the hard numbers.
just the numbers. If we stripped away all your stated intentions and all those beautiful aspirations and we just looked at the cold, raw ledger of where your money actually went and, how the literal hours of your days were actually spent, what would that data prove?
I mean, it would probably be pretty terrifying for most of us.
Totally terrifying. Would it prove that you value your family, or would it prove you value the status of an expensive car lease? Would it prove you value your health? Or would the data suggest that you're primarily acting as an angel investor for the fast food industry and the couch manufacturing sector?
Yeah, the discomfort of that question, I think, really comes from how impossible it is to argue with a ledger.
You just can't.
You can't. I mean, we are infinitely capable of building these elaborate internal narratives about who we are.
Oh, yeah, we curate these identities based on our intentions, right?
Exactly. But the raw data of resource allocation, it's entirely indifferent to our feelings.
It doesn't care.
It doesn't. It acts as this immovable mirror reflecting our actual operational values. When you look at the math, the narrative just collapses into reality.
And it is a terrifying mirror to look into. I actually, I sat down and did this exercise before we started recording today.
Oh, really? You actually did it?
I did. I looked at my last 3 months of credit card statements and my screen time logs. And I mean, the cognitive dissonance was physically uncomfortable.
I can imagine. What did you find?
Well, I like to think of myself as someone who prioritizes, deep reading and staying connected with extended family.
Right, the stated values.
Right. But the data proved I prioritize algorithmic video feeds and premium coffee delivery.
Ouch. Yeah, that's a tough pill to swallow.
It really is. And that confronting realization is basically the foundation for today's deep dive.
Which is such a fascinating topic.
It is. We are examining a source document today titled 013 Resource Allocation Stewardship as Strategic Clarity.
A bit of a mouthful of a title.
It is, yeah. And just to set the parameters for everyone listening, this text is written as a manual for church leadership.
Right.
So, it uses theological language and examines ecclesial structures. But, and this is crucial, the insights it contains regarding organizational drift and the psychology of self-deception and just the brutal honesty of spreadsheets.
Yeah, those apply universally.
Exactly. They apply just as fiercely to a Fortune 500 executive or a freelance artist trying to figure out why they are always burned out.
Well, and the core mission of this text is to completely rehabilitate the concept of stewardship.
Because that word is so loaded, isn't it?
Oh, it's heavily burdened for a modern audience. I mean, you hear stewardship, and it usually evokes this image of a boring administrative duty.
Or a manipulative guilt trip designed to extract donations for a building campaign or something.
Yes, exactly. But the text just tears that definition down. Yeah. It reconstructs stewardship not as some mechanism of restriction or, institutional fundraising.
Right.
Instead, it frames it as the ultimate engine for strategic clarity.
Strategic clarity. I love that phrasing.
It really is the tool that cuts through the fog of organizational good intentions and forces actual alignment.
So to even begin to understand how stewardship creates that clarity, the document forces us to abandon this idea that administrative tools are neutral.
Which is a huge paradigm shift.
It is. The text hits you right in the teeth in its opening argument. It just asks, what does your budget actually believe?
That phrase right there, giving a spreadsheet a belief system.
It's wild, right? It completely shifts how you look at a grid of numbers.
It does, because by personifying the budget, the author forces the reader to recognize that a financial spreadsheet is fundamentally a moral document.
A moral document.
Yeah, it is a public confession of an organization's actual fears and desires. Every single line item, every recurring subscription, every dollar allocated to a specific department, it quietly reveals what that organization protects.
What it's terrified of losing.
Exactly, and what it genuinely hopes will endure.
Okay, let's unpack this because I see this constantly in the corporate tech space.
Oh, I bet you do.
You have a company where, the CEO stands on stage at an all-hands meeting and passionately declares, Agile, disruptive innovation is their core value.
Right, and that is what the text calls their stated theology, the aspirational claim.
Yes. But then when you look at their operational theology, their actual resource allocation, you see that like 85% of their engineering bandwidth and budget is chained to maintaining a 20-year-old legacy code base.
Because leadership is terrified of the short-term revenue hit of a migration.
Exactly. So the stated theology is innovation, but the operational theology is fear-based preservation.
The words create the aspiration, but the allocation creates the reality.
That's it exactly. And the gap between that stated theology and operational theology, that is the exact space where institutions lose their soul.
They really do. And the text provides a really poignant example of this dynamic within a church setting.
Oh, the youth group example.
Yeah. Imagine a congregation that loudly claims its highest value is the next generation.
Right. The pastor preaches about it. They pray for the youth. It's printed in bold on the bulletins.
Everything looks aligned on the surface.
But
Then you audit the discretionary budget.
and what do you find?
You discover that a massive percentage of funds are locked up in maintaining this pristine, climate-controlled sanctuary for the older, existing members.
Well, the youth program is what? Operating in a damp basement on a shoestring budget?
Precisely. Relying on volunteers who are just completely burning out.
Ah.
So the budget is confessing a truth that the congregation refuses to say out loud. They value their own immediate comfort far more than they value the future.
That is brutal. But the psychological mechanism behind that gap is what really fascinates me, because the text doesn't accuse these organizations of malice.
No, it doesn't say they're evil.
Right. It introduces this concept of drift.
Drift, yes.
Like, drift isn't a deliberate, smoke-filled boardroom conspiracy to abandon the youth or stifle innovation.
Not at all. It's the silent accumulation of unexamined continuity.
Unexamined continuity. I like that. So it's just the path of least resistance.
Exactly. Organizations fund the legacy program today simply because they funded it yesterday.
Right.
When a budget is rolled over year after year without a zero-based audit, without forcing every single dollar to justify its existence against the current mission, you are effectively codifying the assumptions of the past.
You let the momentum of historical decisions dictate the priorities of the present.
Yeah, it's basically a massive amplification of the sunk cost fallacy.
Which is so common. Because the emotional friction of cutting a beloved program that has existed for 20 years, I mean, that friction is so high that leaders just keep funding it to avoid the conflict.
Conflict avoidance drives so much of our budgeting.
It really does. But let's dig into how we actually diagnose this health. Because if I look at an organization, whether it's a startup, a nonprofit, a church, whatever, and their calendar is completely packed, right?
Yeah.
They're running 50 different programs, money is flowing in and out, the staff is working 60-hour weeks. I mean, that level of sheer velocity is almost universally interpreted as success.
Motion implies progress.
Right. We naturally associate activity with success.
And the text delivers a devastating critique of that exact assumption. It states plainly, a church can be busy and still be unfaithful.
Wow. Busy and still unfaithful.
Yeah. Activity is an incredibly seductive smokescreen. It creates the sensation of vitality long before fruitfulness can be measured to see if it's real.
Because it feels like things are happening.
Right. When an organization has momentum, it feels healthy simply because it is moving. But momentum is directionless.
That's a great point.
You could be running at absolute top speed, further and further away from your core assignment.
So a crowded calendar and a massive budget might just mean you are highly efficient at executing the wrong mission.
Precisely the danger. I mean, the flurry of announcements, the endless committee meetings, the constant firefighting, all of this activity provides the leaders with a dopamine hit of relevance.
They feel essential.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the actual core mission of the organization is starving to death in the background because all that oxygen is being consumed by the machinery of busyness.
The machinery of busyness. So if that machinery is this dangerous, and if our budgets are these moral confessions that constantly threaten to drift away from our values, we have to look at the root cause.
Right. How do we get here?
Yeah. Why are humans so uniquely terrible at managing resources without becoming defensive, exhausted, or misaligned?
Well, the source document traces this entire dysfunction back to a fundamental cognitive error regarding ownership.
Like ownership, okay.
Yeah, the psychological burden of ownership is where the text really anchors its entire philosophy.
And it roots that argument in a theological premise, right? Specifically Psalm 24.1.
Yes, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Now, whether a listener approaches that from a framework of faith or purely as a philosophical exercise in detachment, The practical implications completely upend how we function.
Because it actively attacks our daily vocabulary. Think about how possessive our language is.
Oh, it's everywhere.
Right. A founder says, my company. A manager says, my team, or my budget.
We say my house, my time, my calendar.
Exactly. And the text points out that this seemingly innocent language is the breeding ground for a theology of control.
We begin to genuinely believe that we are the absolute sovereigns of our little domains.
But when you internalize the belief that you are the owner of your resources, your default psychological state inevitably becomes one of scarcity and fear.
Because an owner's primary directive is survival.
Right. You have to hoard your money, you aggressively protect your time, and you build walls around your team. Because if you lose those things, your empire diminishes.
Your identity is tied to the preservation of the assets.
Exactly. The text argues that the first crisis in stewardship is almost never a lack of actual resources. It is always this deep-seated delusion of ownership.
Yeah.
But I want to push back on this a little, though.
Okay, go for it.
Because the text uses the parable of the talents from Matthew 25 to illustrate this point.
Yes, it does.
So in the parable, a master entrusts money to his servants, leaves and returns to see what they've done with it. 2 servants invest it and make a return. 1 buries it in fear.
Right, and the master praises the investors and punishes the one who hid it.
Exactly. Now, historically, hasn't this parable been used to justify, ruthless profit maximization? Doesn't it imply that the point of being given resources is to generate the highest possible capital return, which feels very much like an ownership mentality?
That is definitely the most common modern capitalistic reading of the parable. But the source text strips that interpretation away to focus on the underlying mechanic of the relationship.
Okay, how so?
The parable is not an endorsement of unbridled capitalism. It is a masterclass in entrusted responsibility.
Entrusted responsibility.
Yes. The defining characteristic of the servants is that they never own the capital they were deploying. The master gave it, the master departed, the master evaluated.
Right.
The text focuses on the servant who buried the talent. Why did he bury it? Because he was terrified of the master. He operated out of fear and an obsession with preservation.
He was trying to protect a static asset rather than deploy a dynamic gift.
Yes. The paradigm shift the text demands is moving from owner to trustee. A steward manages what intrinsically belongs to another.
Ah, I see.
When you realize you are merely holding resources in trust for a specific mission, that paralyzing fear of loss just evaporates.
Because it's not yours to lose in that sense.
Exactly. You aren't desperately trying to defend a personal kingdom against invaders. You are organizing provisions for a temporary assignment.
The phrasing the text uses here is brilliant. It says, Christian stewardship begins with a disruption of the self.
A disruption of the self. It's essentially an ego death.
It really is. It forces the reader to confront the question, what do you have that you did not receive?
Which is a humbling question.
Deeply. Your intelligence, your zip code, your health, your network, if you trace it all back, it's all gifted or circumstantial.
Recognizing that shatters pride.
It does, but I can imagine a listener feeling incredibly anxious about this concept.
Why is that?
Well, if nothing is mine, if my paycheck, my Saturday afternoon, my living room are all just entrusted to me for some larger mission, does that mean my life is reduced to constant restriction? Is the goal of a steward to live in ascetic misery, denying every pleasure because their resources belong to the mission?
Yet the author actually anticipates that exact anxiety. The text explicitly states that a community that views stewardship as mere limitation will eventually grow to resent it.
That makes sense.
If your definition of stewardship is just white-knuckling your desires and constantly saying no to anything beautiful or restful, you have misunderstood the assignment.
Okay.
Stewardship is not about shrinking your life. It is about rightly ordering it.
So it's the difference between rationing water in a lifeboat and using water to cultivate a garden. Both involve careful management, but the intent is entirely different.
That is an excellent analogy. Enjoyment, leisure, art, and rest are not antithetical to stewardship. They are often the fruit of it.
That's a relief to hear.
The pathology arises when we treat resources as if they exist exclusively for our private, isolated consumption, completely disconnected from the health of our community or our core purpose.
Right.
The goal isn't restriction. The goal is purposeful deployment. It's the profound relief of realizing you don't have to carry the weight of being the sovereign lord of your own life.
Okay, so if we manage to surrender that illusion of ownership and embrace the role of the trustee, The immediate practical requirement is to actually inventory what is in the trust.
We have to know what we're working with.
Exactly. What are the inputs we are managing? And the text breaks this down into three deeply interconnected currencies: financial capital, human capital, and time or attention.
Yes. And it treats them as a fragile ecosystem, where a failure in one completely distorts the others.
Let's walk through them.
Sure. We have to understand the specific nature of each currency. Financial capital is obviously the most heavily scrutinized because it is universally quantifiable.
Right. It has spreadsheets, audits, and software dedicated entirely to tracking it.
But that extreme visibility makes it deceptive. We often conflate financial health with organizational health. And the text warns that money is never neutral. It acts as a directional amplifier.
A directional amplifier, so it accelerates whatever trajectory the organization is already on.
Precisely.
Like, if an institution is fundamentally insular and obsessed with its own survival, receiving a massive financial windfall will not suddenly make them outward-facing and generous.
Not at all.
They will just build thicker walls, buy nicer furniture for their private offices, and hoard the rest in an endowment. The money didn't change their culture, it just gave their operational theology a megaphone.
Which is exactly why relying on financial capital alone is catastrophic.
Right.
That brings us to human capital. And the text introduces a really crucial semantic shift here. It explicitly warns against utilizing the corporate language of a workforce.
Oh, this is fascinating. Why?
Because when an organization views its people as a workforce, it reduces human beings to utilitarian units of energy designed to execute the calendar.
Like cogs in a machine.
Exactly. The text instead uses the theological concept of priesthood.
That is a massive distinction. A workforce exists to serve the machinery of the institution. A priesthood implies dignity, unique spiritual gifting, and a sacred responsibility. It suggests that the people doing the work are inherently valuable, not just a means to an end.
When leaders view people as a workforce, their primary management tool is extraction.
Right, like how much productivity can I get out of this person before they quit?
Exactly. But when leaders view people as a priesthood, their primary management tool is formation. How can this organization deploy this person in a way that matures their unique gifts and deepens their character?
But the reality of how human capital is actually managed in most mission-driven organizations, whether it's a church, a charity, or even like an open-source software project, is incredibly bleak.
Oh, it really is.
The text calls out something I think every single person listening has witnessed or experienced firsthand: the hidden subsidy of overburdened volunteers.
Yes, the dependable volunteer.
Right. In almost any volunteer-driven system, you have the Pareto principle on steroids. 5% of the people are doing 95% of the work.
Because they are dependable.
Exactly. They answer the late-night emails, they show up early to set up the chairs, and they just feel too guilty to say no.
And organizational leaders continuously exploit that dependability.
Oh, 100%.
They balance their bloated, ambitious operational goals on the backs of a handful of people who are too dedicated to quit. The leaders look at the successful event and congratulate themselves on a job well done, completely blind to the fact that they are strip mining their best people.
Strip mining their best people.
Wow. The text treats this not just as poor management, but as a moral failure of stewardship. If your resource allocation requires burning out your most faithful people just to maintain the momentum of your calendar, your allocation is fundamentally broken.
So what does this all mean for leaders?
It means you have to notice that hidden subsidy. You are destroying the priesthood to save the machinery.
Which perfectly bridges us to the third currency, the one that makes the other two function: time and attention.
The hidden currency.
The text refers to it as the hidden currency, yeah. And it is the most finite and fragile of the three. We can always raise more money and we can, recruit more people, but the temporal bandwidth of an organization is an absolute hard limit.
And the interdependence here is critical. If you have financial capital but no human capital, you just have a stagnant bank account.
Right.
If you have people but no time, you have mass exhaustion and resentment.
Yeah.
And if you have time but no money, you have underpowered intentions, plenty of theoretical planning with no fuel to execute.
The text illustrates this vividly, right? The community center example.
Yes. Imagine a community center that wants to launch an after-school mentorship program. They need the financial capital to buy the supplies and rent the space.
Okay.
They need the human capital, emotionally intelligent mentors who can handle the work. But crucially, they need the time and attention.
Which means protecting the schedule.
Exactly. They have to actively protect the schedules of both the mentors and the students so they can meet consistently without competing priorities tearing them away. If leadership allows other internal emergencies to constantly hijack the mentor's attention, the program will collapse, regardless of how well-funded it is.
The phrase that stopped me cold in this section was, attention is moral because it reveals love.
It's a beautiful line.
It really removes attention from the realm of simple time management and elevates it to a spiritual metric. What we repeatedly focus our bandwidth on eventually becomes our culture.
Right.
If leadership spends 80% of their meetings discussing legal liability and risk management, they are revealing that their primary love is institutional self-preservation.
You cannot claim to love a community or a mission if you refuse to grant it your sustained, uninterrupted attention.
And managing that attention requires us to confront the single greatest threat to organizational alignment.
Which is rarely what we think it is.
Right. It is rarely a sudden scandal, a hostile takeover, or a massive financial crash. The deadliest threat is the slow, silent paralysis of inertia.
Doing yesterday's work today, simply because the pathways are already established in our brains.
It's just the ghost of the past.
The text uses a brilliant comparative narrative to explain this. The story of two churches. Let's dissect Church A.
Okay, lay it out.
Church A is a historic institution with a beautiful, sprawling campus, stained glass, and a multi-million-dollar annual budget. From the outside, it is the definition of success.
Right, the envy of the town.
But an audit of their operational theology reveals a suffocating reality. The vast majority of their massive budget and staff energy is entirely consumed by institutional maintenance.
Let me guess, roof repairs on a sanctuary that's 80% empty.
Exactly. They're funding a dozen legacy committees that haven't produced a new initiative in a decade. The staff is profoundly exhausted, not from pursuing a mission, but from acting as curators for a museum of past glories.
A museum of past glories. Ouch. And contrast that with Church B.
Yes. Church B has 50 people. They meet in a rented middle school cafeteria. Their budget is microscopic. They cannot afford specialized staff or a dedicated building.
So they are incredibly constrained.
But because of that severe constraint, they cannot maintain the illusion of doing everything. Scarcity forces an existential clarity.
Right.
They focus 100% of their meager resources on their core mandate. Perhaps it's deep local discipleship and running a food pantry. They execute two things with intense, focused power.
And the text asks a highly provocative question here. Which of these two organizations is actually more faithful to its calling?
And the natural, culturally conditioned response is to point to Church A's endowment and scale as proof of blessing.
Right, bigger is better.
But the text argues that abundance was Church A's downfall.
Because abundance allows institutions to hide their misalignment.
Exactly. When you have surplus money and surplus people, you can afford to be incredibly sloppy. You can keep funding a redundant, fruitless program just because a prominent donor likes it, and the system absorbs the inefficiency.
But scarcity strips away the sentimental padding. It's an incredibly harsh teacher.
It forces you to look at the reality.
Yeah. When the money dries up, you are forced to look at every single line item and ask, does this actively serve our mission today, or is it just a ghost from the past?
We saw this during the economic contractions in the tech industry recently,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. Companies that had thousands of employees working on vanity projects that produced no revenue were suddenly forced to ask what their actual product was.
And making those cuts introduces profound emotional friction. Terminating a legacy program, whether it's a software product a founder built 10 years ago or a charity initiative started by someone's grandmother, it feels like a betrayal of the organization's history.
It feels personal.
It does. Leaders will contort themselves into pretzels to avoid inflicting that specific pain.
The text provides a surgical distinction to help leaders navigate that guilt, though. It says, the church must be able to tell the difference between memory and mandate.
Memory and mandate.
Yeah. Memory is the act of honoring what was accomplished in the past. It's beautiful and it's necessary.
Right.
But mandate is the raw obedience to what is required today. Preserving the memory should never be allowed to actively suffocate the mandate.
Because if maintaining the museum of yesterday prevents you from executing the mission of today, the memory has become an idol.
An idol, wow. And the text utilizes the metaphor of pruning from the Gospel of John to illustrate this.
Yes. Pruning is an inherently violent agricultural act. You are taking shears and severing living branches from a tree.
It sounds destructive.
It does, but the vine dresser doesn't prune because he hates the vine. He prunes because he understands the finite limits of the sap.
Ah, resource limitation.
Exactly. If the tree supports too many branches, the energy is distributed so thinly that it produces weak, sour fruit. By severing the redundant branches, the energy is forcefully redirected into new, concentrated, vibrant growth.
I understand the mechanics of pruning, but the emotional reality is where leaders paralyze. Let's bring this into a hyper-practical scenario.
Okay, let's do it.
Suppose a nonprofit is running a community tutoring program. It's a good thing. It helps people.
Yeah.
But the data shows it is draining 40% of the staff's time while only reaching a fraction of the intended demographic, effectively starving their core initiative, which is, say, job placement.
Right.
If the leader shuts down the tutoring program, people will be angry. Volunteers will quit. The community will accuse them of being uncharitable. How does a leader justify saying no to a demonstrably good cause? Isn't saying no to a need fundamentally contrary to the idea of mission?
That is the most difficult psychological hurdle in stewardship.
It feels terrible.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the text answers this by drawing a stark line between a good thing and a called thing.
A good thing and a called thing.
The world is filled with an infinite number of good things, but no organization and no individual is entrusted with the resources to execute all of them.
Right.
The text points to the historical life of Jesus to anchor this. In the biblical narratives, Jesus did not heal every single sick person in the Roman Empire.
He didn't.
No. He would frequently leave a village where there were still desperate, immediate, crying needs, retreating to the wilderness or moving on to the next town. Why? Because he refused to allow the tyranny of the urgent to derail his ultimate strategic mandate.
So if you say yes to every urgent need that crosses your desk, your resources become so diluted that you become completely ineffective at the one specific thing you were built to do.
Exactly. Saying no to a good thing feels terrible in the moment. It requires what the text calls a hard holiness.
Hard holiness.
You have to disappoint people. You have to endure being misunderstood. But that hard no is the only way to protect the resources required for a deeply faithful, explosive yes to your actual calling.
So we know we have to prune, we know we have to overcome inertia and stop funding the past, we know we have to protect our limited resources for our core mandate.
The theory is airtight.
The theory is airtight, but how do we actually execute this without transforming into cynical, corporate, slash-and-burn artists who just destroy morale?
Right. How do we actually do it?
Yeah. And this is where the text shifts from deep theology to a highly actionable framework, the stewardship audit.
Yes. The audit. The purpose of the audit is to externalize commitments and cure what the text identifies as organizational fog.
What is organizational fog?
Fog is that persistent, low-grade anxiety that every leader feels when they know things are misaligned but cannot pinpoint the source. The audit forces the hidden realities into the light. It mandates that we search our operational theology for three specific pathologies: waste, overlap, and underinvestment.
Let's define how the text views waste, because it's not just about, embezzling funds or buying extravagant office furniture.
No, it's far more subtle.
Waste is defined behaviorally as repeated events or sustained efforts that yield little to no fruit. It is the committee that meets every Tuesday for 2 hours but hasn't generated a single actionable outcome in 6 months.
Right. It consumes temporal and emotional budget but produces nothing.
Exactly. Then you have overlap.
Now, this one is insidious because it often looks like high productivity. Overlap occurs when duplicate efforts are competing for the exact same pool of resources, effectively cannibalizing each other. It's two different departments launching separate, uncoordinated software platforms to solve the same internal communication issue.
They are both spending capital, both burning out volunteers, and just diluting the overall energy of the institution.
Precisely. And the third pathology is the one that breaks the heart of an organization: underinvestment.
This is where the gap between stated and operational theology is most glaring.
It really is.
These are the areas that an organization loudly proclaims are its highest priorities, like local outreach, youth formation, or mental health support. But when you look at the ledger, they are surviving on scraps.
They are starved of the financial capital, the human energy, and the sustained attention required to actually move the needle.
Diagnosing these three pathologies requires a pretty ruthless methodology. And here's where it gets really interesting. The text introduces several exercises that share DNA with modern productivity systems.
Specifically, the concepts of capturing open loops and defining next physical actions.
Yes. It definitely channels David Allen's getting things done framework, but it applies it to spiritual and strategic alignment, rather than just inbox zero.
Right. The text emphasizes the stewardship capture list and the mental bandwidth audit.
We don't need to explain the basics of GTD to this audience, but what is fascinating is why the text insists on it for leaders.
Because when a leader holds a massive inventory of vague anxieties, unmade decisions, and misaligned programs solely in their working memory, they lose the capacity for strategic thought.
Exactly. The background hum of uncaptured stressors creates decision fatigue. You cannot accurately audit your organization's mission when your brain is drowning in tactical chaos.
And the application of this is the delete, delegate, delay, do matrix, but viewed through the lens of mission alignment. The text focuses on the immense difficulty of defining the very next physical action.
Give us an example of that.
Well, for instance, a leader might have a floating anxiety. Our volunteer culture is toxic.
Which is overwhelming.
Right, that is not an action. That is a paralyzing realization. The audit forces the leader to distill that down to the physical, actionable lever. Draft an email to the 3 core leaders, scheduling a lunch for Thursday to discuss volunteer onboarding.
You transform a vague, ambient dread into a manageable unit of stewardship.
Exactly. But the text offers a massive flashing warning light here. Do this audit without cynicism.
That's hard, because it is incredibly easy to look at a spreadsheet full of waste, overlap, and exhausted people and become bitterly cynical.
Oh, very easy.
Cynicism looks at the misalignment and seeks a target for blame. It wants to tear the structure down.
But true stewardship looks at the exact same broken data, and its intent is entirely different. Stewardship seeks alignment. It prunes to rebuild. It tells the truth in order to heal, not to punish.
That non-cynical approach is embedded in the text recommendation for a monthly mission alignment check. This is the discipline of looking backward at the end of every 30-day cycle and asking ruthless, clarifying questions.
Like, where did we spend our attention this month?
What initiatives consumed our financial capital?
Did those investments actually yield fruit that aligns with our core mandate? Or did we just drift back into managing the machinery of busyness?
And if we extrapolate that beyond institutional leadership, it brings us to the final, most intimate, and frankly, most confronting application of this entire document.
Right, because up until now, a listener could easily view this as an intellectual exercise about how other people should manage their companies or churches.
Totally. My boss needs to hear this.
Exactly. But the text explicitly refuses to let the individual off the hook. It states that this theology of stewardship is an absolute requirement for the daily life of the individual believer.
Or really, any individual attempting to live a purposeful life.
Yeah, the author writes, the Christian life is full of small budgets, financial, temporal, emotional, and relational. Each one reveals something.
Small budgets.
Yes, the macro dynamics of organizational drift apply perfectly to the microdynamics of a single human life. You, as an individual, are the CEO of a highly complex portfolio of resources.
That's a great way to frame it.
You manage an emotional budget, how much empathy and patience you have to give. You manage a relational budget with your spouse, your children, your friends. And you manage a strictly finite temporal budget of 24 hours a day.
And the feedback loop is inescapable. What you give your resources to fundamentally shapes who you become in return.
This requires a personal audit. We have to look at our own small budgets. Your stated theology might be that you value intellectual growth, deep intimacy with your family, and radical generosity to the poor.
That is the narrative you tell yourself.
But if we audit your operational theology, if we examine your bank statements, your internet browser history, and your calendar, what does the data confess?
It always goes back to the data.
It does. Does the data reflect those lofty values, or does it expose a massive, disproportionate investment in algorithmic entertainment, the pursuit of personal comfort, and the anxious preservation of your social status?
When I really let that sink in, it completely reframed my entire relationship with time.
Really? How so?
Well, it is so culturally acceptable to play the victim of our schedules. I catch myself complaining to friends, I just don't have time to read the books I want to read, or I don't have time to exercise, or I don't have time to really connect with my aging parents.
I all say that.
I say it as if I am the helpless victim of a cruel, fast-paced universe that is actively stealing time from me. But when I look at the actual math of my week, the truth is deeply uncomfortable.
The math doesn't lie.
It doesn't. I had the time. My attention and my temporal budget were simply allocated elsewhere. They were spent doom scrolling on my phone for 90 minutes a night or binge watching a mediocre television show simply because it auto-played the next episode. I wasn't robbed of time by the universe. I consciously misallocated my trust fund.
That specific realization, moving from the passive posture of a victim to the active accountability of a steward, is the absolute turning point of the text.
It changes everything.
The author promises that this level of brutal, uncomfortable honesty is the genesis of repentance. Repentance is the engine of renewal.
Repentance and renewal.
Yes. When you stop acting like a helpless victim of your calendar and simultaneously stop acting like the terrified, hoarding owner of your resources, the psychological relief is immense. Life actually becomes lighter.
Because you aren't carrying the weight of the world anymore.
Exactly. You are freed from the exhausting, endless burden of self-ownership. You no longer have to defend a tiny, fragile empire. You get to wake up and joyfully, strategically deploy the gifts you've been handed for a purpose that outlasts you.
That is profound. Okay, let's retrace the architecture of this deep dive.
That's good.
We started by dismantling the myth of the neutral spreadsheet, recognizing that our budgets and calendars are, in fact, moral documents confessing our operational values.
Right.
We examined the psychological burden of ownership and how embracing the role of the trustee replaces fear with vocation.
We explore the deeply interconnected ecosystem of financial capital, human capital, and time.
Viewing human capital through the dignified lens of a priesthood rather than a workforce.
And treating attention as the ultimate fragile currency.
We discussed the invisible gravity of organizational drift and the hard, necessary holiness of pruning the good things to protect the called things.
And finally, we scaled that institutional audit down to the granular reality of our own daily lives, recognizing that our small budgets are actively shaping our souls. The ultimate takeaway for you, the listener, is a profound reframing of responsibility. Your resources, the money in your bank account, the energy in your body, the hours in your week, they are not a trap designed to burden you with endless maintenance and anxiety.
They really aren't.
They are finely tuned instruments meant to free you to execute your unique mission. But they require constant, vigilant attention, because the law of allocation is absolute. Whatever you repeatedly protect and fund is what you will ultimately become.
And that reality brings us to a final critical thought I want to leave you with, something to mull over long after this deep dive is finished. The text laid down the axiom that attention is moral because it reveals love. Our sustained attention is the truest, most valuable currency of our devotion.
It is.
If that is fundamentally true, what are the implications for our very identity and our very capacity to love in the modern landscape? We live in an ecosystem that is deliberately, algorithmically, and economically engineered to permanently shatter our attention.
It's designed to distract us.
Multi-billion-dollar industries exist for the sole purpose of hijacking your temporal budget and scattering your focus across 1,000 trivial outrages and endless novelty that you do not genuinely care about.
Yeah.
When we surrender our focus to the feed and allow our calendars to be dictated by the ping of notifications, are we slowly, silently bankrupting our souls? Not by mismanaging our wallets, but by mismanaging the one resource we can never earn back. If a totally objective observer took your bank statement, your browser history, and your calendar today, would they find the blueprint of a life engaged in intentional, focused love? Or would they find the scattered wreckage of a life adrift?